There is a woman in most offices, you have probably worked with her or you have been her, who answers every email within minutes, who says yes before the question is finished, who is first to arrive and last to leave, and who has trained everyone around her to expect this. Colleagues call her a lifesaver, her manager calls her indispensable, and yet, year after year, her raises stay modest, her title stays the same, and the people who are promoted around her are often people who did less. This is not a story about unfairness. It is a story about a miscalculation so common that almost no one notices they are making it. Most of us were taught quietly and early that value is proven through availability. Answer faster, say yes more. Never be the bottleneck, be the reliable one. And for a while this works. It builds a reputation, it earns trust, it gets you noticed. But something strange happens once that reputation solidifies. The more available a person becomes, the more available they are expected to remain. Their calendar fills with other people's priorities. Their skill gets absorbed into the machinery of everyone else's convenience. And somewhere in that process, without anyone deciding it on purpose, their value quietly stops being what they can do and starts being simply that they will always be there. Meanwhile, someone else, often no more talented, sometimes less, operates differently. They take longer to respond. They decline requests that don't interest them. They have visible limits, hours they won't work, terms they won't accept, conversations they won't have without preparation. And peculiarly, this doesn't cost them influence. It seems to generate it. Clients wait for their availability instead of demanding it. Employers negotiate around their conditions instead of setting them. Somehow, the less accessible person becomes the more valuable one. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't charisma. It's a signal, one most people never learn to read, let alone send. We tend to think of a boundary as a wall, something defensive, something that keeps people out, something slightly selfish. That framing is almost exactly backward. A boundary, held consistently, doesn't just protect a person's time. It tells the world something about how that time is priced. Every yes given without hesitation communicates one thing. Every no, held calmly and without over-explaining, communicates something else entirely. And people, clients, employers, partners, even friends, are constantly, unconsciously reading these signals to decide how much someone is worth. This is the hidden problem beneath the title of this audiobook. It has nothing to do with self-care and very little to do with confidence in the way that word usually gets used. It has to do with a specific, learnable difference between two kinds of people, those whose limits are apologies and those whose limits are information. The first kind of boundary says, "I'm sorry, I can't." The second kind says, quietly and without needing to say anything at all, "This is what it costs to have me." By the end of this audiobook, you will not be given a script for saying no more often. That would be a shallow fix for a problem that isn't shallow. Instead, you will understand something more useful. Why the instinct to overgive exists in the first place, what it's actually protecting you from feeling, and why, for the people who eventually become difficult to replace, boundaries stop being an act of resistance and start being an act of design. There is a pattern connecting all of this, one that shows up in negotiation rooms, in hiring decisions, in pricing conversations, in the quiet architecture of who gets chased and who gets ignored. It has almost nothing to do with talent, and almost everything to do with a kind of discipline most competent people were never taught. We'll build toward that pattern slowly, piece by piece, because it only makes sense once you've seen it operate from several different angles, in the mind of the person who overworks, in the psychology of the person who negotiates well, and eventually in the mechanics of how reputations are actually priced. For now, hold on to one uncomfortable possibility. The overworked woman in the office, the one everyone depends on and no one promotes, she isn't undervalued because she isn't good enough. She is undervalued because she has never let anyone find out what it would cost to lose her. That distinction is where we begin. Ask most competent professionals what would happen if they said no to their boss twice in 1 month, and you'll notice something interesting. They won't describe a business risk. They'll describe a feeling, a tightening in the chest, a fear that has almost nothing to do with logic. Somewhere underneath the professional explanation, there's a belief operating that sounds something like this. If I stop being useful every time I'm asked, I will stop being needed at all. This belief rarely gets examined because it rarely gets stated out loud. It just runs quietly in the background, shaping decisions for years, and it produces a very specific kind of person, competent, dependable, endlessly stretchable, who has organized their entire professional identity around a single unspoken contract. My worth is equal to my willingness. It's worth asking where this comes from, because it doesn't come from nowhere. Consider a mid-level manager. We'll call him Daniel. A composite drawn from a pattern common enough that most listeners will recognize a piece of themselves in him. Daniel built his career the way many capable people do, by becoming the person who could always be counted on. Weekend deadline, Daniel handles it. Difficult client, last-minute request, a colleague's mistake needing quiet cleanup. Daniel again. For years, this worked exactly as promised. He was liked. He was trusted. He moved up 2 levels in 5 years. Then he stopped moving. Not because his output declined, if anything it increased. He stopped moving because something had shifted in how the organization understood him. He was no longer seen as a person with judgment to be developed. He was seen as a resource to be scheduled. His manager stopped asking him what he thought about strategy and started simply asking whether he could take on one more thing. Nobody set out to diminish him. It happened structurally, as a natural consequence of a pattern he had built himself, one yes at a time, This is the trap almost no one sees coming, because each individual yes looks completely reasonable. Saying yes to your boss once isn't dangerous. Saying yes reflexively as a permanent operating mode quietly rewires how you're perceived, from a source of judgment into a source of labor. And labor, however skilled, gets priced very differently than judgment. Underneath this pattern sits a specific fear, and it's worth naming precisely, because vague fears are hard to outgrow and precise ones aren't. The fear isn't laziness, and it isn't really about the work itself. It's the fear of being discovered as replaceable. If Daniel had said no to that weekend request, some quiet part of him believed someone else would have said yes instead, and the company would have learned uncomfortably that it didn't need him as specifically as he needed to be needed. This is where the myth of infinite capacity actually lives, not in a belief about how much work a person can physically do, but in a belief about what happens the moment they stop absorbing it. Infinite capacity isn't really a claim about stamina. It's a strategy for avoiding a much scarier question. What am I worth when I'm not being useful in this exact moment? Notice what this fear does to behavior. It doesn't just make people say yes more often. It makes them afraid to test what would happen if they didn't. And that avoidance is the actual mechanism keeping the trap alive, because the only way to discover that your value doesn't evaporate the moment you become less available is to become less available and watch what happens. Most people never run that experiment. They protect the belief by never challenging it, and the belief protects them in a strange way from a fear worse than overwork. The fear of finding out they were dispensable all along. There's a second layer beneath this one, and it explains why intelligent, capable people, the ones with every reason to trust their own competence, often fall into this pattern harder than anyone else. Competence creates its own trap. The better you are at absorbing extra work without visibly breaking, the more invisible the cost becomes to everyone around you, including yourself. Struggle gets noticed. Struggle gets accommodated. Quiet excellence gets scheduled. This is why the most reliable people in any organization are so often the most overlooked when it comes to real advancement. Reliability without a corresponding scarcity doesn't read as leadership. It reads as infrastructure. And infrastructure, however essential, is rarely the thing that gets promoted. It's the thing that gets relied upon precisely because it never has to be renegotiated. Somewhere in this pattern is the seed of everything that follows in this audiobook, so it's worth holding clearly. The problem was never that Daniel worked too much. The problem was that his willingness never cost anyone anything, and anything that costs nothing, however valuable it actually is, gets treated, quietly, unconsciously, but consistently, as though it were worth nothing at all. Which raises a question far more interesting than, how do I stop overworking? If reliability alone isn't what creates value, What is it that makes some people impossible to take for granted, while others doing comparable work become impossible to notice? The answer starts somewhere unexpected, not with what people do, but with what they refuse. A few decades ago, a group of researchers ran a simple experiment involving chocolate chip cookies. 2 identical jars were set out, each filled with the same cookies, baked from the same recipe. One jar held 10 cookies, the other held 2. People were asked to rate the cookies' quality, price, and desirability. The cookies were physically indistinguishable, and yet, again and again, the jar with only 2 cookies was rated as more valuable, better tasting, more desirable, worth paying more for, than the jar with 10. Nothing about the cookies had changed. What changed was the information the scarcity carried. A nearly empty jar suggested other people had already wanted them. A full jar suggested no one had bothered. This experiment gets cited often in discussions about marketing, but it points to something much larger than pricing psychology. It reveals how the human mind evaluates worth in the absence of direct expertise. Most of the time, we don't actually know how good something is on its own terms. We infer it from how hard it is to get, from how many other people seem to want it, from how freely or reluctantly it's being offered. Scarcity doesn't just limit supply, it functions as evidence. This is the exact mechanism sitting underneath the pattern from the previous chapter, and once you see it, certain career mysteries stop being mysterious. The endlessly available professional is, without realizing it, running the 10-cookie jar. Not because their work is worse, but because their availability is telling everyone constantly that there's plenty of them to go around. Consider a different kind of professional. A freelance consultant we'll call Renata, who took an unusual position early in her career. She decided she would only take on 3 clients at a time, regardless of demand. When she reached capacity, she said so plainly, "I'm full until spring, no apology, no lengthy explanation, no promise to squeeze someone in." At first, this cost her work. A few potential clients simply moved on. But something else started happening that she hadn't fully anticipated. The clients who couldn't get in immediately didn't all disappear. Some of them waited. And the ones who waited talked about her differently than they talked about consultants who were always available. They described her the way people describe something they had to work to get, as sought after, as excellent, as worth the wait. Her limited availability wasn't just protecting her time. It was quietly manufacturing the exact perception that made people want her time more. This is worth sitting with because it cuts against almost everything we're taught about professional generosity. We tend to assume that saying yes to everyone signals abundance. I have so much to give. But to an outside observer, unlimited yes actually signals the opposite. It suggests low demand. If everyone can have you, the unconscious inference is that not many people particularly wanted you in the first place. There's a psychological mechanism behind this, one that has less to do with vanity and more to do with how the human brain has always assessed value under uncertainty. For most of human history, scarce resources, food, shelter, mates, allies, were the ones worth competing for, precisely because scarcity was usually a byproduct of quality or desirability. The good hunting grounds attracted more hunters. The strongest allies were harder to secure. Our instincts for reading scarcity as a proxy for value are ancient, and they don't switch off just because the resource in question is someone's Tuesday afternoon. This doesn't mean scarcity should be manufactured artificially, and it's worth being precise about that distinction, because performative unavailability, pretending to be busier than you are, playing games with response times, tends to collapse the moment anyone looks closely. What Renata did wasn't a performance. Her capacity really was limited. Her no really meant no. The signal worked because it was true, and because it stayed true even when it would have been easier or more lucrative in the short term to bend it. This is the quiet distinction between a boundary that functions as leverage and a boundary that functions as manipulation. Leverage comes from a limit you would hold even if no one were watching. Manipulation comes from a limit performed only for effect. People, clients, employers, partners are remarkably good at sensing the difference, even when they can't articulate it. A boundary that bends under enough pressure was never really a boundary. It was a negotiating tactic, wearing a boundary's clothing. And once it bends once, it stops sending any signal at all except this one. Apply more pressure next time. What Daniel from the previous chapter never learned, and what Renata discovered, partly by instinct and partly by necessity, is that unlimited availability doesn't just exhaust a person. It actively erodes the very perception of value it's meant to protect. Every time he said yes without hesitation, he wasn't just spending his weekend. He was quietly filling the cookie jar a little fuller, one more time, teaching everyone around him that there would always be another cookie, freely given, no waiting required. The uncomfortable implication here is that generosity and undervaluing yourself can look identical from the outside, and sometimes, disturbingly, from the inside too. The instinct to always say yes often feels like generosity. It rarely feels like a pricing decision. But to everyone receiving that yes, that's precisely what it is, a signal about how much this person's time and attention are actually worth, set not by negotiation, but by default. Which leaves an uncomfortable question hanging in the air. If limits communicate value this clearly, why do so many capable, intelligent people struggle so profoundly to hold them, even when they can see, intellectually, exactly what the cost of never holding them looks like? The answer isn't found in strategy. It's found much earlier in how most of us learn to earn love in the first place. Picture a child who learns very early that being helpful earns something warmer than praise. It earns relief. A parent under strain softens the moment the child offers to help. A sibling's crying stops the moment the child gives up their turn. The lesson isn't delivered as a lecture. It's delivered as thousands of small wordless moments, and the child absorbs it the way children absorb everything important, not as information, but as identity. By the time that child becomes an adult, the connection between usefulness and safety isn't a belief they hold. It's a belief that holds them. This is worth understanding clearly, because it explains something that pure career strategy never quite can. Why capable adults who can intellectually recite every argument in the previous chapter about scarcity and value still find themselves saying yes to the request they didn't want, still find themselves apologizing for a boundary they were entirely entitled to hold. The problem was never a lack of information. Renata's strategy isn't a secret. Most people, if asked directly, could explain the cookie jar experiment and its implications in under a minute. Knowing this doesn't make holding a boundary feel any less like risking something enormous. That's because for many people, it is risking something enormous, just not the something they think. Psychologists who study early attachment describe a pattern sometimes called conditional worth, the belief formed in childhood that love and safety are not guaranteed but earned continuously through behavior that pleases others. A child raised in an environment where affection appeared consistently, regardless of performance, tends to grow into an adult who can tolerate disapproval without feeling existentially threatened by it. A child raised where affection seemed to depend on being good, being easy, being helpful, tends to grow into an adult for whom disapproval doesn't feel like an inconvenience. It feels like danger. This is the emotional architecture underneath what looks from the outside like a simple failure to set boundaries. The overworked professional isn't failing to understand strategy. They're managing a threat response. Saying no to a request doesn't just risk annoying someone. Somewhere below conscious awareness, it risks reactivating the oldest fear they know, that approval is conditional and they are one refusal away from losing it. Consider a specific version of this pattern. A talented junior associate at a law firm, we'll call her Priya, known for never missing a deadline, never pushing back on scope, never appearing anything less than completely accommodating. Colleagues loved working with her. Partners praised her reliability in every review. And Priya, when asked privately why she never negotiated her workload the way some of her peers did, gave an answer that revealed more than she probably intended. I don't want to be difficult. Not I don't have time, not I have too much on my plate. I don't want to be difficult. As though difficulty itself, not overwork, was the real danger she was navigating around. This single sentence contains the entire mechanism. Priya wasn't protecting her schedule. She was protecting her standing in an unspoken hierarchy of who is allowed to exist without apology and who has to continuously earn the right to take up space. For people operating from this belief, every no carries an invisible price tag far higher than the actual stakes of the request. It isn't about the meeting or the deadline. It's about whether they remain someone worth keeping around. Here's what makes this trap so difficult to escape through willpower alone. The approval it earns is real. Priya's accommodating nature genuinely does generate warmth, gratitude, and goodwill in the short term. The reward is not imagined. This is precisely why the pattern is so durable. It isn't a false belief operating in a vacuum unsupported by evidence. It's a true belief operating on the wrong timescale. Accommodation buys immediate approval and slowly erodes long-term respect. And because the immediate reward arrives so much faster than the long-term cost, the trade looks, in the moment, like it's working. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from this arrangement, one distinct from ordinary overwork. It's the exhaustion of never being sure whether you're liked for who you are or for what you provide. And beneath that uncertainty, a quieter, harder question: if I stop providing it, would anyone still want me here? Notice that this is a different fear than the one explored in Chapter 1. Daniel's fear was professional, the terror of being discovered as replaceable. Priya's fear is more personal, older, and in some ways more painful. The fear of being discovered as unworthy of belonging, without a constant offering of usefulness attached. These two fears often travel together, reinforcing each other, but they aren't identical, and it matters to separate them, because they call for different kinds of repair. Daniel's fear responds to evidence. He needs to test in the real world that his value survives contact with a no. Priya's fear responds to something slower and more internal, a growing, hard-won trust that she is allowed to exist, professionally and personally, without constant proof of her usefulness. That kind of trust doesn't arrive from a strategy. It arrives gradually from a person's relationship with themselves, which is precisely the terrain the next stage of this journey will need to enter. But before that internal shift can happen, there's a more immediate, more visible cost worth understanding. Because the approval trap doesn't just wear down the person caught inside it. It quietly, systematically teaches everyone around them exactly how little that person's time is worth asking permission for. There's a moment that happens in almost every over-accommodating professional's career, usually years in, and it tends to arrive not as a dramatic betrayal, but as a small, almost forgettable exchange that somehow never quite leaves them. For Priya, it happened during a partner meeting she wasn't invited to when she overheard, through a half-closed door, her name mentioned in a sentence that wasn't unkind, just revealing. "Priya's great. She'll figure it out," someone said, deciding, without her in the room, that she would absorb a project no one else wanted. Not because she was the best person for it, because she was the safest one to hand it to. That sentence contains a lesson most accommodating people eventually learn the hard way. Being endlessly reliable doesn't just fail to earn respect. It actively teaches people to stop asking whether something is fair to give you and start simply assuming that it's fine. This is the mechanism worth naming precisely because it operates so gradually that most people never catch it happening. Every time a request is met without hesitation, the person making that request receives information, not just about this particular task, but about the general cost of asking. If the response is always immediate, always accommodating, always free of friction, the brain on the other side of that exchange draws an entirely reasonable conclusion. This doesn't cost anything. And once something is perceived as costless, it stops being treated as valuable, regardless of how much effort it actually requires. Economists have a term for a related phenomenon in pricing: anchoring. The first price a person encounters for something becomes the reference point against which every future price gets judged, even when that first price was arbitrary or artificially low. A boundary works the same way. The first time someone says yes to an unreasonable request, they don't just concede one instance, they set the anchor. Every future request gets measured against that first, too generous yes, and any attempt to charge more, push back, or say no later gets experienced by the other party not as fair recalibration, but as an inexplicable price increase. This is why the people most exhausted by unfair workloads are so often the ones who can't figure out how to renegotiate them without guilt. It isn't that their colleagues or managers are unusually exploitative. It's that the anchor was set long ago, quietly, by 100 small yeses that felt individually like nothing. Consider what this looks like in reverse, through the eyes of a manager who has, without realizing it, learned exactly who on the team can be asked for anything and exactly who cannot. This manager doesn't consciously think of herself as taking advantage of anyone. She simply notices over time who responds instantly to late requests and who pushes back, who accepts scope creep without comment, and who asks calmly for the timeline or budget to adjust in return. She isn't cruel, she's efficient. And efficiency, left unchecked, always flows toward the path of least resistance, which means it flows, disproportionately and almost invisibly, toward whoever has made themselves the easiest person to ask. This is the invisible tax, not a single unfair moment, but a compounding pattern in which the most agreeable people in any system slowly become the load-bearing walls of that system, carrying more weight, receiving less credit, precisely because their agreeableness made them structurally convenient rather than individually valued. What makes this tax so difficult to see from the inside is that it rarely presents itself as unfairness in the moment. Each individual request seems reasonable in isolation. Can you take this call? Can you cover this gap? Can you turn this around by tomorrow? It's only in aggregate over months or years that the pattern becomes visible, and by then, the anchor is so deeply set that renegotiating it feels less like asserting a boundary and more like breaking a promise nobody remembers making. Here is the part of this pattern that deserves particular attention, because it inverts a belief most accommodating people hold without question. They tend to assume that if they simply endure long enough, prove themselves reliable enough, eventually the system will notice and reward the sacrifice. But systems, whether organizations or relationships, don't reward endurance. They reward scarcity. A person who has taught everyone around them that their time is freely available has no scarcity to leverage no matter how much they've endured, and endurance without leverage tends to produce not promotion, but simply more of the same request, asked with slightly more confidence each time. This is not an argument for becoming difficult, unreliable, or cold, a fear worth addressing directly, because it's usually the first objection accommodating people raise when this pattern is named. The goal isn't to stop being generous. It's to stop being generous by default, without discretion, in a way that erases the very distinction between a favor and an expectation. A favor given occasionally, visibly, and by choice communicates something entirely different than the same favor given constantly and assumed. One builds goodwill, the other builds an anchor, which brings the pattern to its natural turning point. If unlimited accommodation quietly trains the world to expect more of it for less in return, then the opposite must also be true, that a deliberately held limit doesn't just protect the person holding it. It actively reshapes how everyone around them calculates cost, respect, and worth, often before a single word of negotiation ever takes place. The question that remains isn't whether boundaries help. The previous chapters have made that difficult to dispute. The real question is what a boundary is actually doing, mechanically, when it works, because a boundary, it turns out, isn't simply a wall. It's closer to a filter. There's an old habit among certain high-end contractors and consultants, one that seems on the surface like bad business. When a prospective client's first interaction is disrespectful, a dismissive email, an unreasonable deadline demanded before any agreement, an assumption of availability that was never offered, these professionals don't negotiate. They decline the project entirely, often before a single dollar has been discussed. To an outside observer, this can look like arrogance or worse, like leaving money on the table. But the ones who do this consistently report something curious. Their businesses don't suffer from turning work away. They thrive because of it, not despite the filtering, because of it. This is the piece of the pattern that finally reframes everything the previous chapters have been circling. A boundary isn't primarily a form of self-protection, though it does protect. Its more important function is as a filter, a mechanism that sorts the people and opportunities in a person's life into two categories: those who respect the terms on which someone operates and those who don't. And this distinction turns out to matter far more than most people realize, because how someone treats a limit reveals with startling reliability how they will treat everything else. Consider what actually happens the moment a boundary is introduced into a relationship, professional or personal. Someone requests something outside the agreed terms, a discount, a favor, an exception, an hour of unpaid time. The response to a calmly held no divides people cleanly. Some accept it without resentment, adjust their expectations, and continue the relationship on its original terms, often with increased respect. Others push, guilt, escalate, or quietly disengage. This second group isn't just failing to respect a schedule. They're revealing that the relationship, for them, was conditional on unlimited access in the first place. This is worth sitting with, because it inverts a fear that keeps many people from setting limits at all. The fear that a boundary will cost them a relationship worth keeping. In practice, the relationships that dissolve after a reasonable boundary is introduced were rarely the relationships worth preserving. They were relationships sustained by one party's excess, not by mutual respect. And their disappearance isn't a loss. It's information, arriving early, before more time was invested in discovering it the hard way. A specific pattern shows up again and again among people who reach senior positions of real influence, not managers who simply have more authority, but people whose judgment is actively sought, whose time is genuinely difficult to get. Almost without exception, they describe a period, usually earlier in their career, when they made a deliberate decision to stop taking on clients, collaborators, or opportunities that didn't meet a certain threshold of respect or alignment, even when they could not yet afford financially to be selective. What they discovered wasn't immediate abundance. It was often initially a period of contraction, fewer clients, fewer emails, a quieter calendar than before. But the clients and collaborators who remained were different in kind, not just in number. They were the ones who valued the work enough to meet its terms, and because they valued it, they tended to pay better, refer more, and demand less unreasonable flexibility in return. The filter hadn't just removed bad relationships, it had concentrated the good ones, and concentration, it turns out, compounds in a way that dilution never can. There's a useful way to think about why this happens, borrowed loosely from how markets behave under price signals. When something is offered without limits or conditions, it doesn't just attract people who value it, it attracts everyone, including people who would never have paid the fair cost for it in the first place, and who now occupy the time and attention that could have gone to someone who would have. A boundary, functioning as a filter, doesn't reduce total opportunity so much as it redirects it, away from those extracting value without offering fair exchange, and toward those willing to meet the actual terms of the relationship. This reframes the fear explored in Chapter 3, the fear underneath Priya's inability to say no. The deeper worry beneath most unset boundaries isn't really about losing a specific person or opportunity. It's the fear of discovering, through the filter, how few relationships were actually built on mutual respect to begin with. That's a frightening thing to learn, but it's considerably less frightening than spending years investing in relationships that only existed because no filter was ever applied. None of this means boundaries should be rigid, punitive, or announced as ultimatums. A misunderstanding that causes some people, once they grasp this principle, to overcorrect into a kind of defensive coldness that creates its own problems. A filter doesn't need to be dramatic to work. Often it's barely visible, a response time held consistently, a rate not discounted reflexively, a request for advance notice honored without apology. The filter does its work quietly, over time, simply by remaining consistent under pressure, which is precisely where most people's boundaries fail, not in the setting, but in the holding. And this is where the conversation has to turn inward, because everything examined so far, the scarcity signal, the approval trap, the invisible tax, the filter, describes what boundaries do in the world. None of it yet explains what makes a boundary possible to hold in the first place, especially under the specific kind of pressure that tests it most. The disappointed face, the escalating request, the silence that follows a no that used to be a yes. That capacity doesn't come from a technique, It comes from somewhere earlier and steadier, a relationship with oneself that has to exist before any limit can survive contact with another person's disappointment. There's a specific moment that separates people who can hold a boundary from people who can only announce one, and it has nothing to do with the words they use. It's the moment right after the no leaves their mouth, when the other person's face changes, a flicker of disappointment, surprise, maybe irritation, and the boundary either survives that flicker or dissolves into an apology, an exception, a hurried, well, maybe I could. Almost everyone can learn the language of boundaries. Fewer people can survive the silence that follows one. This is worth understanding precisely because it explains a frustration common to anyone who has ever tried to fix their over-accommodation through scripts and strategy alone. They learn the right words, they rehearse the calm tone, and then, in the actual moment, faced with someone's visible disappointment, something older and faster than strategy takes over, and the boundary quietly collapses, not because the words were wrong, but because holding them required a kind of internal steadiness that scripts alone can't manufacture. That steadiness has a name, though it's often misunderstood. It isn't confidence in the way the word usually gets used, the loud, performative certainty associated with charisma or bravado. It's something quieter and considerably rarer, self-trust. The felt sense that a person's worth doesn't fluctuate based on whether the person in front of them is currently pleased. Consider what's actually happening, psychologically. In the instant someone reacts badly to a boundary. For a person without self-trust, that reaction gets processed as data about their fundamental standing. Evidence, however small, that they may have made a mistake, disappointed someone unforgivably, revealed themselves as difficult or unworthy. For a person with self-trust, the same reaction gets processed as simply that. Someone else's reaction, uncomfortable perhaps, but not a referendum on their value. The disappointment is allowed to exist in the room without needing to be immediately resolved. This distinction explains something that puzzles many people trying to build better boundaries. Why the advice to just say no so rarely works on its own. Saying no is not the hard part. Tolerating the discomfort that follows is the hard part, and no amount of scripting addresses that. Because the discomfort isn't really about the specific interaction, it's about whether a person has, somewhere along the way, developed a stable enough sense of their own worth to withstand someone else's temporary disapproval without needing to fix it immediately. This is where the fears explored earlier in this audiobook finally converge. Daniel's fear of being discovered as replaceable and Priya's fear of being discovered as unworthy of belonging are, underneath their different textures, the same fear wearing different clothing. The fear that worth is not a settled fact but a constantly renewable verdict issued by whoever happens to be evaluating them in the moment. A person operating from that belief cannot hold a boundary reliably, no matter how strategically sound the boundary is, because every instance of disapproval reads as a potential final verdict rather than a passing weather system. Self-trust, by contrast, doesn't eliminate the discomfort of disappointing someone. It changes what that discomfort means. It becomes possible to think, simultaneously, this person is upset with me, and I am still someone worth knowing. Two facts that for someone without self-trust feel mutually exclusive, and for someone with it, simply coexist. It's worth being honest about how this capacity is actually built, because it isn't built quickly, and it isn't built through willpower. It tends to develop the way most durable psychological capacities develop, through repeated, survivable evidence. A boundary is held. The disappointment that follows doesn't destroy the relationship or the person's sense of self. That evidence accumulates, slowly, until the nervous system stops treating a boundary as a threat and starts treating it as simply a normal, survivable part of being a person with limits. This is why the very first boundaries anyone sets tend to be the hardest, not because the stakes are higher, but because there's no accumulated evidence yet that the fear was wrong. There's a practical implication buried in this that deserves attention, because it reframes where change actually needs to begin. Someone who has spent years overworking, over-accommodating, and over-explaining cannot simply decide on a given Tuesday to become a person who holds firm limits with total ease. That expectation sets up an almost guaranteed failure, followed by a familiar, discouraging conclusion that boundaries aren't really who I am. What actually works is smaller and less dramatic, choosing one low-stakes limit, holding it through the discomfort that follows, and letting that single piece of survivable evidence begin, slowly, to update a belief that took years to form and will take more than a single conversation to unform. This internal shift is not a detour from the practical external strategies explored earlier in this audiobook. The scarcity signal, the filter, the invisible tax, it's the foundation underneath all of them. A person can understand every principle covered so far with complete intellectual clarity and still find themselves unable to apply any of it if the deeper belief in their own conditional worth remains unaddressed. Strategy, without self-trust, produces boundaries that look right on paper and collapse under the first real test. Self-trust without strategy produces someone who can tolerate discomfort but has no clear sense of where or how to apply it. Put those two together, though, a settled sense of one's own worth combined with a clear understanding of how limits function as signals, and something changes. The boundary stops being an act of resistance, something summoned with effort against an internal current of guilt. It becomes something closer to a design choice, made calmly, the way a skilled negotiator might set a price, not out of fear and not out of defiance, but simply because it reflects an accurate understanding of what's actually being offered. This is precisely the capacity that separates people who merely survive high-pressure environments from people who quietly run them. The subject the next chapter turns to directly. There's a detail that tends to surprise people who study skilled negotiators up close. The most effective ones rarely raise their voice, rarely rush, and rarely seem particularly anxious to close the deal. What they do instead, consistently, is something smaller and easy to miss. They let silence sit in the room without rushing to fill it. When a term doesn't work for them, they say so plainly, without over-explaining, and then they wait. This waiting is not a tactic borrowed from a negotiation seminar. It's the external expression of everything explored in the previous chapter. A person who doesn't need the other side's immediate approval to feel secure in the exchange. And it turns out that this quality, more than any specific technique, is what separates people who negotiate well from people who simply talk about negotiating well. Consider how this plays out in a pricing conversation, one of the clearest places boundaries and income intersect directly. A consultant quotes a fee. The prospective client hesitates, perhaps suggests a lower number, perhaps mentions a competitor who charges less. There are broadly two ways this moment tends to unfold. In one version, the consultant, uncomfortable with the silence and the implied disapproval, begins justifying the price, adding extra value to soften the ask, or simply lowering the number before the client has even finished objecting. In the other version, the consultant states the reasoning behind the fee once, briefly, and then stops talking. The second response feels, to many people watching it happen, almost unbearably risky. And yet it is, empirically, the version far more likely to hold the original price. Why? Because over-explaining functions unintentionally as a signal of uncertainty. Each additional justification communicates beneath the words, "I'm not entirely sure this price is fair either." Silence, by contrast, communicates the opposite. "This is simply what it costs, and I'm comfortable letting you decide whether that works for you." This dynamic explains a pattern common among senior leaders and executives who have earned genuine authority in high-stakes environments. Their communication, particularly around limits, tends to become sparer, not more elaborate, as their standing increases. Junior professionals often assume that authority is built through more explanation, more justification, more visible effort to be persuasive. What actually happens at the more senior levels is closer to the reverse. The explanation shrinks because the need for external validation shrinks. A limit stated once, calmly, without repeated defense, reads as far more credible than the same limit defended 3 different ways, because repeated defense implies the limit is up for negotiation, and a limit that's up for negotiation isn't really a limit at all. This same principle governs something less obvious: time. Executives and leaders who are genuinely difficult to access not through artificial gatekeeping, but through real, consistently enforced limits on their availability, are rarely perceived as arrogant for this, provided the limit is applied evenly and the work itself justifies it. What damages perception isn't the limit. It's inconsistency. Being unavailable to some people while remaining instantly reachable for others, a pattern that reveals the limit was never really about capacity, but about a hierarchy of whose comfort matters more. A boundary held selectively isn't a boundary. It's favoritism wearing a boundary's language. There's a further layer to this worth naming, because it addresses a common misconception about power and boundaries. The assumption that only people who have already achieved seniority or leverage can afford to hold firm limits. In practice, the causality often runs the other direction. The limit frequently comes first, and the leverage follows, because the limit is what forces a renegotiation of terms that would otherwise never have been questioned. Renata from Chapter 2 didn't become selective about clients after she became established. Her selectivity, held early and consistently, was part of what established her. This reframes something important about the earlier chapter's central claim. It isn't simply that high earners can afford boundaries because they've already succeeded. It's closer to the reverse. They succeeded in meaningful part because they treated their limits as non-negotiable, well before the market had confirmed that this was a reasonable thing to do. The confidence discussed in the previous chapter isn't a reward for arriving at seniority. It's frequently the mechanism that gets a person there. There's one more dimension worth examining before drawing these threads together, because it clarifies something that could otherwise be misread as coldness. The people who use limits most effectively in high-stakes environments are rarely, in private, rigid or withholding people. Many are, if anything, unusually generous, with mentorship, with unpaid advice to people they respect, with time given freely to causes or relationships they've chosen deliberately. What they've eliminated isn't generosity, it's default generosity, the kind extended automatically to anyone who asks, regardless of whether the exchange is mutual. Their generosity has simply become a choice again, rather than an obligation, and choices, unlike obligations, are what people actually respect. This is the thread that now needs to be gathered together. Across every chapter, the scarcity signal, the approval trap, the invisible tax, the boundary as filter, the self-trust beneath it, and now its expression in rooms where real leverage is negotiated. One pattern has been quietly repeating itself from different angles. It's time to see it as a single mechanism, rather than a series of separate observations. There's a question worth returning to now, the one that opened this audiobook without ever being stated directly. Why does the least available person in the room so often turn out to be the most valuable one in it? By this point, the answer isn't a single insight. It's a mechanism built from 6 moving parts that have been examined separately, but were never really separate at all. Here is the shape of that mechanism seen whole. It begins with a belief, inherited early and rarely questioned, that value is proven through availability. This belief produces a specific behavior, reflexive yes-saying, absorbed without negotiation, which feels from the inside like diligence. But that behavior sends a signal outward, whether intended or not, and the signal is scarcity's opposite. Unlimited access reads, to anyone receiving it, as unlimited supply, and unlimited supply, regardless of its actual quality, gets priced accordingly, cheaply and eventually without much thought at all. That mispricing doesn't stay contained to a single transaction. It compounds. Each yes anchors the next expectation a little lower until an entire relationship, professional or personal, operates on terms quietly set by the least deliberate exchange within it. This is the invisible tax, not unfairness delivered all at once, but unfairness accumulated one reasonable seeming request at a time until the most agreeable person in any system becomes its most burdened and least credited member. The way out of this isn't simply refusing more often. A refusal offered without conviction collapses at the first sign of disappointment, and a boundary that collapses under pressure doesn't just fail to protect a person. It actively confirms to everyone watching that their limits were never real in the first place. This is why the mechanism cannot be repaired at the level of behavior alone. It has to be repaired underneath the behavior, in the belief that made the behavior necessary. The quiet, often childhood-formed conviction that worth is conditional, renewed only through continuous usefulness. Self-trust is what allows a limit to survive contact with someone else's disappointment. Without it, every no risks feeling like a small referendum on a person's right to exist without apology. With it, disappointment becomes something that can simply be witnessed, rather than something that must be immediately resolved. This is not a personality trait some people are born with and others aren't. It is built slowly through the accumulation of survivable evidence, one held boundary at a time, each one making the next slightly less frightening to hold. Once that internal steadiness exists, something changes in how a boundary functions in the world. It stops being a wall built defensively against being taken advantage of and becomes something closer to a filter, sorting relationships and opportunities by how they respond to a clearly stated limit. Those that respect it deepen. Those that resist it reveal, early and cheaply, that they were never built on mutual respect to begin with. The filter doesn't shrink a person's world. It concentrates it, trading a wide, shallow field of obligation for a narrower, more valuable one of genuine exchange. And this, finally, is what gets expressed in rooms where real stakes are being negotiated. Not aggression, not coldness, but a kind of calm specificity, a limit stated once without over-explanation and allowed to stand in silence. That silence is not empty. It is the clearest signal a person can send about what their time, attention, and judgment actually cost. Put together, these 6 movements form a single reversal of the belief this audiobook opened with. We are taught that reliability means being endlessly available, always reachable, always accommodating, always the safe option to hand something to. But the version of reliability that actually builds value works differently. It isn't endless, it's predictable. A person whose limits are consistent, whose yes means something because their no is real, becomes reliable in the way that matters most. Not as an inexhaustible resource, but as someone whose word, in both directions, can be trusted completely. Call this the reliability reversal, the recognition that dependability was never about being available to everyone, all the time. It was always about being exactly as available as you say you are, no more, no less, and letting that consistency become the actual foundation of trust, instead of the exhausting, ever-expanding substitute for it. This is the mountain this audiobook has been climbing, one chapter at a time. Daniel's fear of being replaceable, Priya's fear of being unworthy, Renata's cookie jar, the anchor of the invisible tax, the filter that sorts real relationships from conditional ones, the self-trust that makes any of this survivable, and the quiet authority it produces in rooms where the stakes are highest. None of these were separate lessons. They were the same discovery, approached from 6 different directions. That a limit held consistently and without apology is not the opposite of value. It is very often the source of it. Return for a moment to the person this audiobook opened with, the one who answers every email within minutes, who says yes before the question finishes, who has been called a lifesaver so many times that the phrase has started to feel less like praise and more like a job description. Picture her now differently, not because her skills have changed, and not because she's suddenly been discovered by someone powerful enough to fix her situation for her. Picture her instead having simply stopped, not stopped working, stopped confusing her availability with her worth. She still says yes often, perhaps as often as before. But something underneath the yes has shifted. It's no longer automatic. It's chosen, which means the no beside it, on the occasions she offers one, finally means something too. She has stopped anchoring every future expectation with the most generous version of herself she's ever offered. She has let a few relationships, built entirely on her excess, fall away, and discovered, with some surprise, that this loss felt less like grief and more like room being made. This is not a dramatic transformation, and it was never meant to be one. Nothing about this audiobook has argued that boundaries are a shortcut to success, or that saying no more often will, on its own, rearrange a career. What has been argued, chapter by chapter, is something quieter and considerably more durable. That value is read by others largely through signals, and that unlimited access has always been one of the clearest signals a person can send about how little they believe their own time is worth. The introduction promised clarity, not motivation, and it's worth returning to that promise directly now, because clarity is a strange kind of gift. It doesn't feel exciting in the way encouragement does. It feels more often like something settling into place. The recognition that the exhaustion carried for years wasn't a personal failing to be overcome through more effort, but a structural consequence of a belief that was never actually true. Worth was never earned through constant availability. It was only ever priced that way because no limit had been offered to suggest otherwise. There is a kind of relief available in this understanding, one distinct from the relief of finally succeeding at something. It's the relief of realizing that the hardest, most exhausting strategy, being endlessly useful to everyone all the time, was never actually the strategy working best. The people who seemed from the outside to have some effortless advantage were not working from a different rulebook out of arrogance or luck. They had simply stopped operating from the belief that their presence had to be justified continuously, one accommodation at a time, in order to be allowed to remain. None of this requires becoming a different kind of person. It requires only the willingness to test, in small and survivable ways, whether the fear underneath the old pattern was ever actually true. Whether saying no once to something reasonable to decline really does end in the catastrophe it always seemed to promise. Most people who run this experiment discover what Renata discovered with her cookie jar of 2, that scarcity, held honestly, doesn't repel the people worth keeping. It reveals them. So consider one final time the question this audiobook has quietly been circling since its opening minutes. Not how to work harder, or become more impressive, or acquire some new skill that finally earns the recognition that's felt, for so long, just out of reach. Consider instead something simpler, and considerably more within reach than it may have seemed an hour ago. What would change in your career, in your relationships, in your own sense of what you're worth, if your limits stopped apologizing for themselves and started quietly speaking first? That is the boundary blueprint. Not a wall, not a performance, a signal finally sent clearly about exactly what it costs to have you.